Welcome everyone to the Stanford freshman who brought down a university president. Actually, you're also called in the program, Theo, student, writer, change maker. That's quite a business card.
I know, I should do the Mark Zuckerberg thing. Where I just put it on the card.
We've sat down before, and I think of Theo as the enfant terrible of investigative journalism. That's because, as everyone here knows, a story he doggedly pursued for over a year, but beginning within a few weeks of arriving as a freshman at Stanford University, when most people are trying to figure out which clubs to join, he took up a story. Well, he'll explain how it happened, but it forced the resignation of Stanford's president, for which Theo won, is the youngest ever recipient of the, people here probably know, but the really ultra prestigious George Polk Award, one of the highest honors in the field, highlighting courage, integrity, and the pursuit of accountability. And I would say we should really drink a toast to your phenomenal success, but you're too young to drink.
Thanks for rubbing that one in.
Getting up there 2 weeks from his 20th birthday. But actually, so let's just start there. I mean, you're a kid on campus. You think of yourself as a coder. You do hackathons, and do you go out on a lark for the paper? And how do you get from figuring out where the daily is to this story? Because I understand it wasn't assigned to you, right?
No, I've never been assigned a story so far, which I'm very happy about, because most journalists can't say the same. Just quickly wanted to say first, thank you, Harry, for doing this. Harry is an amazing interviewer, interlocutor, and also has been very steadfast in standing up for media during trying times. So it's great to be here with you, and great to be here at this event. Yeah, applause for you. Absolutely.
Thanks a lot.
So as you mentioned, I did not come to Stanford to be a journalist. It was actually the only career path I had ever ruled out for myself was journalism. Like anything else, garbage collector, tech megalomaniac, like anything in between.
There's
just not
an
a
inside
journalist.
story, but I'll leave it to you whether to mention it or not. But certainly journalist, not. Okay.
So my family, I come from a family of journalists. My parents are journalists. But actually, the reason that I signed up for the school paper was a different family member. Just a couple weeks before I showed up at Stanford, my grandfather, my mom's dad, passed, unfortunately. And I've never met someone in my entire life who talked more about student journalism, like ever. And he wasn't actually a journalist. He was sort of a journalist by disposition, but he was a lawyer by trade. And he would sit me down, he'd put me on his knee, and he'd tell me about summers working for the local paper. And so I showed up to Stanford, and I said, well, screw it. I'm not going to be a journalist, but I am a 17-year-old. I would like to have some friends. We'll show up there and write a couple stories, and things sort of spiraled from there.
And give us a little bit about the Stanford Daily. You said you've never been assigned a paper. I signed up for the school paper, and I covered the basketball team, and I now remember my big scoop on the appointment of a new master in one of the residential houses. It was a little different for you, and I think it took a fair bit of, moxie or self-possession. Literally, if you remember, what happened from the early times you said to I got an idea.
Yeah, well, I think the kinder word that people use for people like me is precocious. I think the more accurate word is dickish.
Yeah.
I pardon my French, not to be insensitive on stage, but I have never been somebody who is particularly content with sort of taking my time and figuring things out. And I was raised in a household where if you have a question, you just go out and ask it. And so I showed up to the Daily, and the Daily is cartoonishly understaffed, which is great for me because it meant that I could do literally whatever I wanted. I showed up. There were a couple of investigations I started out on, and I kept writing, and then I started learning more stuff, and eventually I started writing about the Stanford president, which is the story.
Right. So I see some of the early stuff you did led to the president, and I really should stress, because we talked about it before, led is a very under-emphasizing word. You spent a year, you've told me before, you spoke to something like 10 people for every one you used. You didn't want to source it at Stanford. So this was a really consuming task. When you started it, did you have any reporter spider sense that like where this could go?
God, I mean, the truth is, and my friends will tell you that I think I was probably more naive about this than other people, and that when I first reported the first big story about this, I still thought that honestly not that much would come out of it.
And when are we here in your freshman year?
So the first story I ended up writing about the Stanford president was in November of 2022. Actually, it was the day I came back from Thanksgiving break. I wrote the draft on the plane flight back. I touched down. I went straight to the Stanford Daily house. I was on the phone with the lawyers all night. And then at 3 a.m., we clicked the publish button, and I said to my editor, God, I hope I don't get kicked out.
You were on the phone to lawyers because the Stanford Daily wanted to do a libel check before you printed it.
Yeah, and actually, so this was something that was super essential throughout my reporting, is the fact that the Daily, has a great skeleton. It's an independent 501c3, which means that it is editorially and financially independent from the university. We had exceptional lawyers, which became super important because as this reporting went on, the president of Stanford, who was also at least a multi-centimillionaire, close to a billionaire, hired the chair of Cooley, which is the big Silicon Valley law firm. And this guy, Steve Neal, is best known for getting Charles Keating off in I guess it was the 70s. Yeah. And he later went on to work for Elizabeth Holmes, and then worked for the Stanford president to come and try and stop my stories from being published.
So we're talking about all of a sudden a very sort of tense-pitched, all the president's men kind of vibe of this. Why don't you...
More all the president's freshmen, to be clear.
Very good. Give us the basics of... It's a very complicated story that you unwound little by little by little, eventually went to the top, but give us the sort of, 30-second or 3-minute version of what you uncovered.
30 seconds to 3 minutes. All right, I'll do my best. So Marc Tessier-Lavigne, who was the president of Stanford, was a brilliant and world-renowned neuroscientific pioneer. He was a super impressive person. He was the first in his family to go to college, and then won himself a Rhodes Scholarship, went on and got his PhD and did his postdoc at Tom Jessel's lab in Columbia. And the work that he did there, and then as a PI in UCSF, helped uncover and create an entirely new field of research in axon guidance. So he discovered something called netrins, which are the proteins that help guide our axons connecting to one another. And he went on, he became the chief scientific officer of Genentech before becoming president of Rockefeller and then Stanford. So what I reported on was about, 25 years worth of unreported research misconduct allegations in work that he was the principal author on. And this ranged from image splicing and duplication and manipulation, and some of these panels that they would take as evidence in biological papers, right? The images are not just examples, they are literally the evidence for the claims that you're making. And some of these panels had been taken and twisted and warped and spliced together to make it look like there were results that weren't real results.
Which you determined how?
So there was a range of stuff involved. The first stories relied heavily on my working with these image sleuths, forensic image analysts who, for a living, are incredibly dogged investigators of specifically this type of misconduct that I was investigating. But ultimately, I did more work to get inside his labs. And so the biggest story related to the Stanford president happened while he was at Genentech. So Genentech, this giant, huge corporation, arguably the world's first biotech company. And Marc Tessier-Lavigne is CSO. And he publishes a paper in 2009, he's the senior author on, that claims to have found the cause, effectively, of Alzheimer's. It claims that he's identified the protein bind that causes neurodegeneration, and that this is going to be a new drug target, that we have finally resolved, one of the hardest scientific problems that we've tried to tackle as an international community. And this is a huge paper. And people think it's Nobel-worthy. I mean, they are just blown away because it's an entirely new hypothesis. They highlight it. They're at the time trying to be acquired by Roche. And so they use this. They highlight it during their investor presentations when they're arguing that Roche should actually pay $42 billion more than what they're going to pay us, in large part because of this paper and this research and what Marc Tessier-Lavigne is doing. And they were successful in that campaign. However, the paper was bunk. And there was an inquiry a few years later in 2012 that resulted in the disappearing of the sort of on-the-rise postdoc who had done most of the work on the paper and whom the scientists I consulted with all say had fraudulently concocted the experiments in the paper. And Marc Tessier-Lavigne was made aware of this. He was called back to Genentech. He was forced to face a grilling over what he had known and what he hadn't known. And he was urged by a number of really prominent people to retract the paper because they believed it was fraudulent. And he refused to do that. And as I reported, over the course of 25 years, at numerous occasions when he was presented the opportunity to correct the record, when he had published pieces of scientific literature that had won him massive acclaim, thousands of citations, just this incredibly vaunted position, he did not avail himself of opportunities to correct the record. He did not deal with this transparently or forthrightly. And he created a culture in his lab, and this is ultimately also what Stanford investigators concluded, that he created a culture in his lab that rewarded the winners and marginalized the losers. And he gave every incentive, not directly, but indirectly created a culture in which this sort of falsification kept happening again and again, and he didn't catch it.
So stunning, and we maybe understand a little bit in broad strokes, but as you were reciting it, Theo, I couldn't help but try to figure as a reporter how each of those steps, how painstaking, thorough, precarious, right? There's got to have been a point when it all came out, the trustees got together and actually brought him down. But I assume there was a time when the cute little freshman in the hall they started hearing about, they understood was a real danger to the administration. Did you ever sort of get a point of tension between the Daily and you when you were held at arm's length, warned to be careful what you were doing?
Oh, yeah.
So as a maybe now 18-year-old or whatever, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I was warned from the start that...
By whom exactly?
Well, the first person who warned me was before the first story came out. A senior administrator who I knew for different reasons, not related to my reporting, and I trusted implicitly. And he said, "Oh my God, keep me away from this. They're going to go after you. Whatever you do, don't do anything on your Stanford email because they might read it. Don't do anything that gives them any sort of vector of attack." And as it went on, I had professors who told me, "I think you're great, you're amazing, let's get coffee, but we have to do it off campus because no one can see me with you." I mean, people would literally tell me as an 18-year-old, "I cannot be seen with you." And when Marc Tessier-Lavigne would, attack my reporting, he lambasted it as breathtakingly outrageous and replete with falsehoods, which is a great quote. I really love it.
And he is the president of arguably the most prestigious research university in the world. You're a punk to them.
Yeah, I'm a kid. And he would email these long missives defending himself to all of the faculty. And that includes all of my professors, obviously. And I would go into class, and I felt sort of like a zoo animal because at a certain point, people would say, and they saw me as, "Oh, you're that kid." oh, you're doing that.
Or,
You know, I remember like I would be like sitting in my dorm room and they put up these, you know, posters with your name on them outside of your door. And I remember I was sitting there at one point freshman year and these like couple people are walking past and they stop and they say, oh my God, it's him. It's that person. And like I'm literally sitting inside. I can hear you, you know.
Yeah. Not your typical freshman year. Yeah. Okay, and there's so much more about this, but you're working on a book, and there are things about the conference I want to talk to you about. Let's just give the triumph, the end of all the President's Freshman movie, where, wow, the kid is right. The president's going down. Did all this sort of kind of develop in very short order? And, you know, this sense of triumph when you'd been warned away so much by people who most freshmen would be kind of afraid to talk to. Give us that kind of, you know, denouement on the story.
Yeah. Well, the denouement, as you say, was actually very unclear at the time. I went off the summer after my freshman year. I was going to Berlin to investigate Russian oligarchs.
Why not?
I ended up, unfortunately, getting a little bit too distracted by the oligarchs back home.
Right.
But no, so the denouement is that Stanford's committee and the board of trustees, and I now have more reporting from the inside, but at the time, they were completely sealed off. I mean, they would not leak, they would not say anything. It was really hard to get a read on what their internal investigation was turning up or not turning up.
Are your stories done now? And then now the investigation's happening?
Well, so they opened an investigation. The board of trustees opened an investigation into Stanford's president less than 24 hours after my first story. And I got to say, that's exactly how I felt, right? I was not expecting quick action. I'd written a few investigations about the school at that point into other topics, and every time I'd seen the same response, which is that I write the story, I write 5 follow-up stories, they still don't respond to me, they still don't respond to me, they still don't respond to me, until suddenly it's on national TV, and they put up a web page indirectly responding to it and say, we'll look into it. But within 24 hours, the board says, we're going to look into these allegations. You know, I was lucky. The stuff that I ran with, I had a lot more stuff that I didn't put in the first article because I just wanted to put the most solid stuff forward first. And so within 24 hours, they start investigating. But the entire investigation is just such a mess. And you know, I think they themselves might admit that too. In retrospect, they open the investigation with a statement that praises Tessier-Lavigne's integrity and honor, right? Which seems sort of like prejudging to people who are already suspicious. And then they appointed a committee of themselves to investigate. One of the people they put on the committee had an $18 million stake in Marc Tessier-Lavigne's company. And so it was sort of a series of self-owns until they hired Mark Phillip, who is the lawyer who's probably best known for getting Boeing off for the 737 MAX stuff.
You hadn't mentioned this before. Is this the Kirkland partner, former DOG?
Exactly, Mark Phillip.
Yeah.
And Mark, by the way, Mark has a great reputation among lawyers.
Deservedly.
You know, he's seen as a real mensch. He's good friends with Michael Ludig, who I think is known to this conference's attendees. But Mark came in to run the investigation, and so by the time it was the middle of the summer and they were ready to put out their report, I didn't know it was coming. I really didn't. The story I'd written.
We're summer 22 at this point?
23. And so I'd prepared a story, actually.
You've already won the Polk at this point.
I'd won the Polk 6 months earlier at that point.
Okay, so go ahead.
I actually, it was perfect. So I put out my big story about the Alzheimer's research, and Mark attacked it very viciously. And then 3 days later, they announced the Polk Award, which I was.
Exactly.
No, but so
I happen to have George Polk right here.
John Darton stares behind me.
Right.
No, so in the summer, when the report was going to come out, I didn't know it was coming. And what I did know is that a week prior, I had gone to them for comment. They hired Edelman, which is the biggest PR firm in the world, to do their comms and to handle me effectively. And I came to them and said, I have a story that I'm ready to report. I want your comment on. And the story was that they had not offered people anonymity, right? That people were not talking to them. They were afraid because they had NDAs and because Mark is very rich and can be very vituperative. And these people were not guaranteeing that they would have anonymity if they spoke to them. So people weren't talking to the committee. And so I go to them, I say, I have this story, do you guys want to comment? I immediately get a phone call from the comms guy, the crisis comms guy. He says, don't publish the story. I say, what do you mean? What are you talking about? He says, look, I'm going to let you in on a secret. We're done with the report, or we're almost done with the report, and it's going to come out next week. If you agree to hold off on this story until we lift the embargo on that report, we'll give you an embargo, which means we'll give you the report 24 hours in advance, and you can look through it, and you agree to publish when we release it publicly. If you don't hold the article, we won't give you the embargo. So my editors and I are sitting there talking about what we should do, what should we not do. We ultimately do agree to the embargo because it's more worthwhile for us to have more time to write a story based on the 300-page report. And so 24 hours before the report is supposed to come out, I email the guy and say, where is it? He doesn't respond. 23 hours before it's supposed to come out, I say, where is it? And he doesn't respond. And at this point, I'm sitting alone in the bedroom of a family friend in a Berlin apartment. And it's like 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., and finally they give me the report. And so I read through it, I go through as quickly as possible, and I type up my story, and I stay up for the next 6 hours. And so it's 9 a.m. roughly, and I finally finished writing my story. I've been awake all night. And then I get a call from an editor at a different newspaper, and they say, hey, so what is your reaction that Marc Tessier-Lavigne is stepping down? And I say, what? And then I get a call from another editor who says the same thing. And it turns out they have given a different embargo to every other news organization. And they assume that I, the person who am running the story, am not going to figure out that this guy is resigning. Like, who do you think the editors are going to call?
Yeah.
And so
I just want to say, basic journalistic ethics for anyone. That's a card they'll play, but embargo means you and you alone. That's dastardly.
Well, I expected that.
The cardinal.
I know. That came from Jerry Yang, by the way, who hates my guts, as far as I can tell.
Can you blame
Jerry,
him? Yeah.
maybe you disagree if you ever see this. And so they tried to screw me over even at the last second by telling every other news organization the news and trying to keep it from us to get us on the back foot, I guess. But the entire process, Marc Tessier-Lavigne never once sat down for an interview with me. He didn't answer 99% of the questions I ever sent. In fact, actually, it wasn't until after he resigned that I ever got an email from him. I had emailed him literally hundreds of questions, and we did this little dance every time. I would send him questions, his lawyer would send back an angry response to me, and I would send the questions right back to Marc Tessier-Lavigne. And so in that way, he never responded to me, and I never responded to the lawyer. But we kept doing this dance over and over and over again until finally, this coda came with the ouster. And obviously, I think that changes the tenor of the story in some ways. But I don't know. In that moment, I got to say, when I got that call and I got on the phone with Mark Phillip and I said, why didn't you tell me this? And they agreed to give me the embargo. And so I, rewrite my story in an hour, and it all breaks, and now I'm here.
There you have it. Yeah. First, what a story. Would be a story that would be the highlight of any professional journalist, sort of 50-year career. Well, I'm in some ways, right place, right time. But really, Theo, I think for how a normal student journalist might have gone about this, especially taking the incoming flack from people who everyone's gone to school to basically study at the feet of. It's remarkable. Now, of course, you've done it. He's been brought down. There's the normal concept in America for people who have done great things early on of the sophomore slump. For you, there's kind of a literal issue. You've just gone out for walk on to the basketball court and won the NCAAs with dunks, and that's the equivalent of what's happened. So, and I don't mean that as only praise, because you're still 19 or 18 at the time, and what happens next? And when you and I have spoken before, it was more embryonic. It's now, I think, really coming to term, if I can stay with that. So you've been working now for 5-6 months intensively on a book project. And it actually, as you were talking about Stanford, there's kind of a link here to Stanford as a prestigious institution, but one that leverages its prestige in somewhat unsavory ways. So, give us the basic subject matter of the book. And let me just add, do you have a sense of when it might see the light of day?
Yeah, so this is the first time I'm talking about the book publicly in any way, shape, or form. So I got to be a little bit careful with what I say. Yeah. But if anyone should hear it, it should be the Rancho Mirage crowd.
He's really good, isn't he? Yeah, anyway, go ahead.
Well, there's a reason people who are far more impressive than I keep coming back to this conference year after year. I mean, they put on a pretty good show.
Okay.
So I'm writing a book about money and fraud in Silicon Valley. And,
little stuff.
A lot of fun subject matter, some really great characters, I promise. But really, I'm trying to chronicle the sort of rise to prominence of, the next generation of oligarchs, right? And watch in real time at all stages of the process how young, brilliant, idealistic kids get taken in and given every opportunity in the world and learn that they can cut corners and no one's going to call them on it. And it starts small, it starts with embezzling the dorm funds, and then you're taking money from VCs for an idea you don't have, and then it goes, up and up and up, and you see, I think, some of the results of that with the president. I think there's a real tie there with the sort of lack of accountability culture. And then you also see it with, my book is about, more broadly, sort of Stanford and its real association with, Elizabeth Holmes, with Do Kwon, with Sam Bankman-Fried, with, people who are just as much a part of the fabric and the DNA. Elizabeth Holmes is just as much a part of Stanford as Hewlett or Packard, right? These two things live side by side. And so my goal is to really chronicle this culture of innovation and, really quite extraordinary boundary pushing that lives and coincides with this culture of fraud and greed and avarice and overambition.
Wow, but also the serendipity, the timeliness of it, which was not exactly your doing, but we've been talking in a media panel yesterday about the sort of stunning fact that at the inauguration, members of Congress are asked could they sit in the back so that the real power in the country, the titans of the Elon Musk, Bezos, all the big four, could sort of be there. We think of those guys as being kind of American pioneers who themselves sort of, crafted their own ways with brilliant intelligence. You're positing a kind of a second generation and one that's very carefully sort of engineered, and there's, it sounds like to me, I'm as eager as everyone else to see it when it comes out, but almost a new, well, we used to think of certain elite universities as breeding grounds for hail fellows well met who would come to take over Wall Street and the like. And it feels like it's that, or the 1890s or 1940s are to that, as the tech age precisely is to kind of Stanford. I have a sense that you actually identify, or the tech industry identifies like a stratum of anointed people who they kind of identify early on, bring along, and what could be a very, story with some complications, but nevertheless a kind of encouraging story of fostering talent, et cetera, turns sour. And pretty early, you're brought into the club, and the password for the club is a little bit rank.
Yeah.
So just describe a bit that kind of part of, and I'll take another step back, which just 10 or 15 years ago, and I say this as a nerd / geek myself, the people who came to now social and financial dominance in the country were really, pimply at 3 a.m. kind of not your prestigious American types. And now it's kind of changed. So give us the part of the story that actually connects with the identified, including the identification of an elite to be within the Stanford campus.
Yeah, so I mean, look, you raise, right, the Harvards and the Yales of the world, and their immense privileges have also been, I think, recorded in some detail in the past. And actually, like 1L, for example, is sort of a model for me in some ways of the story that I'm trying to tell. Scott Turow's excellent book from, I guess, the 70s about his first year at Harvard Law. The thing that's very different about Stanford than anywhere else in the world is its complete integration with Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley and Stanford could not exist without the other. They're entirely interdependent. And Wall Street has close ties to Harvard and Yale, and DC very much does too. But the difference is Silicon Valley is literally built on Stanford land. Like if you just take the companies that have actual offices on Stanford's campus and you total what they're worth, it's almost $6 trillion. And those are the companies with offices at Stanford, right? And now...
You mentioned more wealth creation in the 20 years there than the gold rush. It's a second,
In many metrics, Silicon Valley in the last 30 years has been the greatest creation and concentration of wealth in human history, right? And this is gold rush. It really is a modern day gold rush, but the resource that people are trying to mine is talent, right? It runs on human talent, on capital. And the earlier you can get your hooks into the next Mark Zuckerberg, the richer you're going to be and the more claim you win. So there's a whole cottage industry of people who are after the people who are deemed the next rulers of the world, the people who are tapped on the shoulder and said that they are going to be masters of the universe. There are VCs who will literally only fund freshmen and sophomores because by the time you're a junior, you're too old, right? And so that's what makes this different, is that the inside group at Stanford is afforded from a couple weeks entrance at the school, as a 17-year-old as I was, just this world of access and access that is almost beyond anything. Like if I were to tell this story as a novel, people would say, get out of here, it's unrealistic. People have admitted to me in on-the-record interviews to embezzling funds, to having slush funds, to having shell companies in countries they've never visited. 18-year-olds, they've admitted to insider trading and misleading VCs. And they're proud of it, or they don't really see the problem.
And do they feel they were brought along? So we know what happens to the best athletes when they've been anointed, and so, the things that a university or university sponsors bestow on them. What kind of goodies do these guys get other than, or is it simply come on in, have dinner with the head of Google and here's the research?
Some of this I got to keep for the book,
okay.
But there are yacht parties and castles and orgies and many
honestly,
weird...
these are those.
Oh I went to a gay VC party once in San Francisco at a mansion. Gay VC party, by the way, crazy concept. And at like 10:15 p.m. or whenever it was, and it was probably much later in the night than that, everybody starts trooping out, and I say, "Where are you going? What's happening?" They say, "Oh, it's time for the sex party." I say, "Are you coming?" I say, "I'm still a minor, so."
So astonishing kind of showering of largesse on kids who whatever level of maturity we think Elon Musk might have. Imagine that when he was 18, right? So let me just say, when it comes out, I'm sure you're going to have Hollywood folks. Maybe they already are knocking on your door. It sounds like such a combination of rich human stories, but also corruption and also just American wealth creation at quite the moment. I know you want to kind of keep it to yourself. Probably that's part of writing a book too. Is you talk about it too much and it's almost sort of superstitious. But is there an end point? Are you chronicling it, or do you follow people and do things come crashing down as they did for Elizabeth Holmes, say? You think of these people as invulnerable, but is there a grown-up who actually imposes order and honesty.
Yeah. I like to think the book is, neither polemical nor hagiographic. It's something of a portrait.
It's important. One quick question: is it more a portrait of the students, the anointed, or the Silicon Valley, or it's just inseparable?
I do think it's inseparable. I think it's sort of a portrait of the broader culture that I'm trying to capture. And the idea is that the book chronologically takes place over the course of my freshman year. So it starts with me arriving and it ends with Marc leaving. And over the course of that year, it's also sort of a very, and this is the part that makes it much harder to write, but it's a very personal book. It's told through my eyes as I come in and I want to be a part of this crowd, and I am part of this crowd, and suddenly I'm at Stanford and 2 weeks in and I'm partying at a mansion in the hills with a bunch of teenagers, paid for by a slush fund funneling money from VCs.
Because you're a good hacker.
Because I'm a good coder, and that's what I came to do.
Yeah.
And then over the course of the year, I find myself getting drawn toward journalism and toward the fight for accountability, and sort of watching in real time, the next Marc Tessier-Lavigne's developing, in front of my own eyes, my own friends, as I'm reporting on, his journey to becoming who he is. And it is, I will say, it's weird being in the middle of this, witnessing, the next Elizabeth Holmes, on the rise, right? Knowing, from the start. And these people are likable sometimes, and they can be friends, and they show up and you get coffee with them and you get drunk and you party and you play beer pong, and yet at the same time they're telling you about how they want to be the next neo-industrialists. And it's weird, right? And what makes the book hard to write is that I'm sort of right in the middle of it, right? And sometimes a participant in it. And I'm also going to these parties. I'm also at all the VC dinners. I'm also having people throwing money at me and trying to say, no, I'm trying to focus on doing this other thing where I'm talking about how the money goes wrong. And so it's kind of, parts of the book are anguished, which I guess is typical of the angsty teenager that I am, or at least was when I was.
I think you're selling yourself short. You chose to put yourself in the center, and that comes with territory, I think. Speaking, however, of the angsty teenager, I would like to talk about this book for another couple hours, but in the time we have left, a real theme of this conference has been the rapid changes in media, and angsty teenagers are come up a lot, in the last few days, and in particular, the extremely different ways in which younger people seem to consume news, the way in which their practices kind of threaten legacy media, what it portends, not just for legacy media, but who's next, All right, they don't like NBC perhaps, but why BuzzFeed? So in the time we have left, I thought you could sort of talk a little bit. Well, I'll set it up with your line, which is the best, couldn't do a better one. Young people and their news habits, you wrote to me, are a ticking time bomb.
Yeah.
Discuss.
Oh boy, yeah, 6 minutes to deal with what I think is probably the biggest
we wanted to get to a little personal questions too, but okay.
Okay, I'll do the speed run.
Debbie is very firm at say it'll be cut out, so.
All right. Young people consume a lot of content right now, and the more content they consume, the less news that they consume. Right, and the way that we as a generation, and this is my thesis, and so younger people in the room, feel free to call me out for being totally full of it.
I don't know if there are any younger.
Young people, there we go.
Younger. Okay.
Anyway. We consume our content more passively now than at any other time in the history of media consumption. We are fed the things that we see either because friends are sharing them or because algorithms that think they are our friends are telling us what to look at, right? And that is a fundamental challenge for news organizations, is that young people are not engaging with written media at all. And I remember, I was training the Stanford Daily senior writers at one point. I was running a training session, and these are the senior beat reporters who've been on the job for a year and a half or whatever, and they have a certain requirement of how much they have to write, and they get paid too, I think. And my icebreaker while we were waiting for everyone to go around was, so what was the best article you read of any kind in the last week? And more than half of the senior reporters at the Stanford Daily had not read a single article of any kind in any publication in the prior week. And that, like, those are the writers, right? And everyone else is a lot more on that end of the spectrum. So we are not prepared for distributing our content to young people, and young people betray some real troubling signs. Last year, there was a study that Princeton did, a nationally representative sample, 4,000 18 to 24-year-olds. And in that study, fewer than 1/3 of the respondents in the multiple choice questionnaire could say who the two parties in charge of Congress were. And that's where we're starting, right? And it's going to get a lot worse. And so I think it's a ticking time bomb, you're right. And I also, last spring, I wrote an article for The Atlantic. It was a 6,000-word magazine feature about how the tensions have sort of spiraled after October 7th. It was not a political piece. And the reaction to it was thousands of death threats. I mean, I literally could not walk outside of my dorm without someone either verbally or physically accosting me. I was called a leftist hack by the Wall Street Journal editorial board and a right-wing maniac by The Intercept. But there was this complete lack of acceptance that there can be a story in between the black and white, right? That it can be possible that, you know, something that's happening 7,000 miles away is important, but also how we talk about it on our campuses is important. You know, I was writing stories that weren't on the borderline. I was talking about rabbis getting followed out of an anti-Semitism event saying, get off our campus, you will all be replaced, you know, that all Jews are pedophiles, and something about tunnels in Brooklyn. Like, you know, I was writing about my computer science TA who wants Biden to be hanged, and my, you know, friends who treat protests so cavalierly that it's a pregame for a party, right? And they're protesting, and I very much understand why people are protesting what was happening in Gaza, but they're protesting by hanging our interim president in effigy with blood-stained hands because he's complicit in genocide, when Stanford doesn't have any investments in Israel. And so the whole premise of, like, there are so many things to be protesting for, but instead of doing that, you know, we're protesting over something that isn't true and doing it in a way that is so completely dogmatic that it enables bad faith actors to go along with the movement because they're on our side, right? And that, I think, is a really troublesome sign. Like, I think illiberalism is on the rise in an extremely worrying fashion, not just with the right and not just with the left. But especially, I think, with the people that I've witnessed in my generation who hold on to beliefs without questioning whether there might be alternative, you know, ways of understanding the same fact sets. And by the way, who hold on to those beliefs oftentimes with fact sets that are deeply flawed.
Well, and see, this is the big point. It's so benighted, and I think black and white, never the twain shall meet. That's a huge part of what's going on overall. And I assume what happened with you is you look at the first paragraph, he's Team Gaza, he's Team Israel, and that is literally the end of it. So it really has so much to do about discourse in a democracy. Man, is this a big issue? There was, I don't know if Jeff Cowan and James Bennett have sat down yet, but it's a whole panel on illiberalism that is going to be really good. Theo, I'd like to talk 45 minutes more about each of these stories, but let me just end with a personal question. You described yourself, and you've explained, as an accidental journalist. You know, you're 20. 2 weeks into your 21st year, do you feel now you're on track to become a journalist, or like most 20-year-olds, are you giving some thought to the NBA or whatever?
I mean,
you've conquered it all. No, I mean that seriously.
You guys haven't done a good job of leaving us a very, stable field doing here.
You thought we might?
God, I had some faith.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think I do want to work on this problem of getting information to young people delivered in a way that is prioritizing facts, but also is catering toward young people. Major news organizations have not done a good job of understanding their audiences, and they do not write for the people that they need to consume their content. So if there's something that I would like to work on, right, it's trying to bridge the gap between these two worlds that I have one foot in, right? The professional, real independent journalism, that the same rigorous post-Watergate tradition that American media continues to inhabit, but also this young, new, digital forward age that is just unlike anything that has come before, and that I think we all need some help in figuring out.
And it's only going to get more intense.
Yeah.
As we hit the zero, please join me in thanking Theo Baker.
Thank you. Appreciate it.